Hello everyone, and welcome to Whispered Abyss. Relax, settle in, and get ready as we dive into tonight's story. Let the darkness take you, and let's begin. The plan had been simple: a New Year's Eve getaway with close friends. Emily, her boyfriend Nate, and their two best friends, Sarah and Mike, rented a secluded cabin deep in the woods. The pictures online promised cozy vibes, a roaring fireplace, a snow-covered landscape, and all the peace they needed to escape the chaos of city life. It seemed perfect. They arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon, turning the snow outside a faint blue. The cabin was just as charming as the photos, though eerily quiet. The only sound was the crunch of their boots on the packed snow as they unloaded their bags. Inside, it smelled faintly of cedar and something else Emily couldn't quite place, like damp wood or mildew. "Rustic charm," Nate joked, setting down a cooler full of drinks. Sarah and Mike laughed, but Emily felt a twinge of unease. Something about the silence seemed too absolute. She chalked it up to being so far from the city and brushed it off. As the night wore on, they settled into their celebration, drinking and playing board games by the fire. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the old windows. They barely noticed, too wrapped up in laughter and New Year's resolutions. But as midnight approached, Emily's phone buzzed. She looked down to see a notification. No signal. "Great," she muttered, showing the screen to the others. They all checked their phones. Every one of them was offline. No big deal, they agreed. They weren't here for social media anyway. Nate shrugged and went to get more drinks from the car. Minutes passed, then more. By the time 10 minutes had gone by, Emily started to worry. "Nate," she called out, poking her head outside the door. The icy wind bit at her face. The car sat in the driveway, but there was no sign of him. Only Nate's footprints led toward it, disappearing into the darkness. Her stomach churned as she stepped onto the porch. The woods loomed dark and endless, and the snow had started falling again, erasing his tracks. "Nate!" she yelled again, louder this time, but the only response was the howling wind. Midnight was approaching, and Nate was nowhere to be seen. Emily's voice echoed into the empty woods, swallowed by the relentless wind. She turned back to the cabin, hoping Nate had come in through another door while she wasn't looking. "Sarah? Mike? Did Nate come back?" she called as she stepped into the warm glow of the living room. Both looked up from their game, confusion clouding their faces. "No, isn't he at the car?" Sarah asked, standing up. Emily shook her head, her unease deepening. "I didn't see him. His footprints just stopped." Mike grabbed a flashlight. "He's probably messing with us. You know how Nate is." His tone was reassuring, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. They all bundled up and headed outside to search, their breaths visible in the icy air. The flashlight beam danced over the snow-covered ground. "Here are his tracks," Mike said, pointing to the faint impressions leading toward the car. But, just as Emily said, the footprints vanished a few feet from the vehicle, no sign of Nate, no path leading back. The snow had begun to fall heavily, quickly erasing what little evidence was left. "Maybe he wandered into the woods for a joke," Sarah offered, though her voice wavered. Emily's stomach twisted. "Why would he? It's freezing out here. This isn't funny." Mike swung the flashlight toward the tree line. The beam caught something. Movement. "Nate!" he yelled, but whatever it was disappeared before they could make out its shape. They stood frozen, their eyes fixed on the dark woods. The only sound was the wind, though it now seemed punctuated by faint creaks and snaps, like something shifting in the trees. "We should go back inside," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "If he's out there, he'll come back." Reluctantly, they retreated to the cabin. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. When they closed the door, Mike turned the deadbolt, muttering, "Just in case." Emily checked her phone again. No signal. Midnight was only 20 minutes away, and her heart pounded with every passing second. She stared out the frosted window, hoping Nate would appear at any moment. But instead, she noticed something chilling. Faint, new footprints leading from the woods, directly toward the cabin door. Emily's breath hitched as she stared at the fresh footprints in the snow. They were faint, like someone had been moving slowly, cautiously, but they led straight to the cabin door. "Guys," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Someone's been here." Sarah and Mike rushed to the window, their faces pale as they followed Emily's gaze. "That's not possible," Mike muttered. "We just came inside. We would have seen them." Well, they're here now, Emily snapped, her nerves fraying. And where is Nate? What if he's hurt or worse? Mike grabbed the flashlight again, but Sarah clutched his arm. Don't. If it's not Nate, do you really want to open the door? The three of them stood frozen, listening intently. The wind howled outside, but beneath it, they heard faint creaks, like someone walking on the porch. Then came the soft sound of fingers brushing against the wooden door, followed by two deliberate knocks. Knock, knock. Emily's stomach churned. Her first instinct was to throw open the door, hoping it was Nate, but something stopped her. It didn't feel right. The knocks were too calm, too measured. She exchanged a nervous glance with Mike, who shook his head and whispered, "Don't open it." "Who's there?" Emily called out, her voice barely steady. No answer, just silence. Minutes passed, and the knocking didn't return. Finally, Mike peered through the peephole. "There's no one there," he whispered, his brow furrowed. Sarah backed away from the door. "This isn't normal. First, Nate disappears. Now this, we need to call for help." "We can't," Emily reminded her, holding up her phone. "No signal. The car keys are with Nate. We're stuck." The tension thickened as they debated what to do next. The cabin, once cozy and inviting, now felt oppressive, like the walls were closing in. Emily glanced back at the window. The footprints were still there, but now they seemed deeper, as though whoever had left them had been standing in the same spot for far too long. And then she saw it. Another set of footprints, this time leading away from the porch, vanishing into the dark woods. Had someone been watching them and decided to leave? Or were they never really alone in the first place? The air in the cabin felt suffocating, thick with an unspoken fear. Emily couldn't shake the image of the fresh footprints leading both to and from the porch. Whoever, or whatever, had been outside was gone now, but the uneasy silence that followed felt more sinister than the knocks. Mike, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline, finally broke the tension. "I'm going back out," he said firmly. "If Nate's out there, we can't just sit here doing nothing." "Are you insane?" Sarah hissed, grabbing his arm. "You saw those footprints. What if it's not Nate? What if it's someone dangerous?" "We can't leave him out there," Mike shot back. He looked at Emily for support, but she hesitated. She wanted to find Nate, but every instinct screamed that something was wrong, something they couldn't explain. "Fine," Mike said, grabbing his coat. "Stay here. I'll check near the car and come right back." "Mike, wait!" Emily protested, but he was already at the door, unlocking it with a sharp click. The icy wind rushed in as he stepped out, the flashlight beam cutting through the falling snow. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving Emily and Sarah alone in the oppressive quiet. Sarah sank into the couch, her hands trembling. "This isn't how the night was supposed to go," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Emily didn't respond. Her focus was locked on the window, watching Mike's light as it bobbed toward the car. The light stopped, and Emily squinted, trying to make out what he was doing. He stood still for what felt like forever, then abruptly turned and began running back toward the cabin. The flashlight beam jerked wildly as he moved, almost as if he were being chased. "Open the door!" Mike's voice boomed, muffled but urgent. Emily scrambled to unlock it, yanking it open just as he stumbled inside. His face was pale, his breath ragged. "What happened?" Emily demanded, slamming the door shut and locking it again. Mike looked at them, his eyes wide with fear. "There were more footprints," he gasped. "Not Nate's, and I swear I saw someone, just standing in the woods watching me. When I pointed the light, they moved." Sarah's face drained of color. "How many?" Mike swallowed hard. "3 sets, all coming toward the cabin." The three of them huddled near the fireplace, the warmth doing little to combat the cold dread settling over them. Emily's mind raced. 3 sets of footprints coming toward the cabin. Who were they, and what did they want? Mike paced back and forth, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. "We need to stay together. Whatever's out there isn't normal. They didn't move like regular people." Sarah sat on the couch, shaking her head. "This isn't happening. It's just a prank, right? Someone messing with us?" Her voice wavered with desperation, but her own words seemed to ring hollow. Emily, peering out the frosted window again, froze. The faint outline of more footprints appeared in the snow, leading toward the porch. They were fresh. Too fresh. Her chest tightened as she whispered, "They're back." Mike and Sarah darted to her side, staring at the tracks. The footprints stopped just short of the porch, as though whoever left them was standing right outside, watching. But no one was there. Knock, knock. The sound was louder this time, more deliberate. Sarah whimpered, clutching Emily's arm. "Don't open it," she pleaded. Mike held the flashlight steady, his jaw clenched. "I'm not opening it, but I'm going to see who's out there." He moved to the peephole and peered through. "Do you see anything?" Emily asked, her voice barely audible. Mike didn't answer at first. His face paled, and he took a step back. "There's no one there," he whispered. "But the footprints..." He pointed toward the window again. Emily's stomach dropped. The footprints were moving, one step at a time, heading around the side of the cabin. "They're circling us," Mike muttered. He swung the flashlight toward the kitchen, where another window overlooked the back of the cabin. The beam of light caught something, a shadow slipping past the glass, too fast to make out. "Did you see that?" Emily hissed. Sarah clutched her head, rocking back and forth. "We're trapped! We're trapped! We should have stayed home." Suddenly, the lights flickered, plunging the cabin into darkness. The only illumination came from the dying fire and Mike's trembling flashlight. Then, from somewhere outside, a distant voice echoed through the howling wind. It wasn't Nate. "Midnight's coming," the voice said, calm and chilling. "And so are we." Emily's heart pounded as the voice faded into the howling wind, leaving a chilling silence in its wake. She grabbed Mike's arm. "We need to barricade the doors and windows, now." Mike nodded, his flashlight flickering as he moved toward the front door. "Sarah, grab anything heavy and bring it here," he ordered. Sarah hesitated, trembling, before stumbling toward the kitchen to find something useful. Emily hurried to the windows, checking each one for signs of movement. Outside, the snow seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight, but the footprints had disappeared. It was as if the intruders had vanished into thin air. Her breath fogged the glass as she whispered, "Where are you?" From the back of the cabin came a loud crash. Emily spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Mike raised the flashlight, and Sarah screamed from the kitchen. "They're at the back door!" she shrieked, running into the living room. Emily grabbed the fire poker from the hearth, gripping it tightly as they moved toward the kitchen. The back door rattled violently, the handle jerking as though someone, or something, was trying to force it open. Mike aimed the flashlight at the door, his voice steady but tense. "Stay behind me." The rattling stopped abruptly, and for a moment, the silence was worse. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy, moving along the side of the cabin. Emily's pulse quickened as she realized they were heading toward the front. "They're trying to get in," she whispered, her knuckles white around the poker. "Keep quiet," Mike hissed, motioning for them to stay low. The three of them crouched in the corner, their breaths shallow. The footsteps stopped again, this time directly on the porch. A long pause followed, then a soft scraping sound, like nails dragging across the wooden door. Emily couldn't take it anymore. "What do you want?" she yelled, her voice trembling. A low laugh echoed in response, chilling her to the core. Then came the voice again, closer this time. "Midnight is here." The old grandfather clock in the corner struck 12, each chime ringing out like a death toll. On the final chime, the cabin door creaked open, though the deadbolt was still locked. The cold wind howled in, extinguishing the fire completely, and the flashlight flickered out. Emily, Mike, and Sarah huddled together in the pitch-black room as a faint whisper surrounded them, coming from all sides. "We're inside now." The whispers grew louder, circling them, each word dripping with icy malice. Emily clung to the fire poker, her breath shallow and fast. She could barely make out Mike's silhouette in the darkness, his flashlight dead in his hands. Sarah whimpered beside her, frozen in terror. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the whispers stopped. The cabin fell silent once more, save for the faint sound of the wind outside. For a brief moment, Emily thought it was over, that whatever had been tormenting them had left. But then she noticed something horrifying, the faint glow of footprints appearing in the snow-covered floor inside the cabin. One by one they emerged, starting at the open door and moving toward the three of them. Emily's grip tightened on the poker as the steps stopped mere feet away. A voice, low and chilling, spoke from the darkness. "You shouldn't have stayed!" Mike lunged forward, swinging the flashlight wildly, but there was nothing there. The beam revealed an empty space where the footsteps ended. Then, "Run!" Emily screamed, grabbing Sarah's arm. The three of them bolted toward the front door, their movements frantic and clumsy. The wind hit them like a wall as they stumbled outside, slipping in the snow. Emily looked back over her shoulder at the cabin. The door remained wide open, but no one was there. And then she saw it. A faint figure standing in the window, its face obscured by shadow. Behind it, two more figures emerged, watching silently as the trio fled into the woods. They ran blindly through the snow, their breaths ragged and their feet numb from the cold. Emily didn't dare look back again, but the feeling of being followed was overwhelming. Every now and then, she thought she heard faint laughter on the wind, growing fainter as they put distance between themselves and the cabin. Hours later, they stumbled onto a deserted road and flagged down a passing car. The driver, an older man, looked at them with concern as they recounted their harrowing night. "That cabin," he said, shaking his head. "It's been empty for years. No one's supposed to go out there." Emily glanced back toward the woods, her stomach turning. In the faint light of dawn, she could just make out the cabin in the distance, its windows dark and lifeless. But as the car sped away, she could swear she saw three figures standing on the porch, watching them leave. Even now, Emily doesn't know who or what was in that cabin with them. All she knows is that they barely made it out, and she'll never go back to the woods again. For New Year's Eve, Maria had decided to stay in her cozy apartment instead of joining her friends downtown. It wasn't that she didn't enjoy parties, she just needed a quiet night for herself. She prepared a simple dinner, lit a few candles, and turned on her favorite playlist. Outside, snow fell softly, blanketing the city in an almost magical calm. As midnight approached, Maria poured herself a glass of champagne and sat by the window, watching the occasional car pass through the quiet street below. The glow of streetlights reflecting off the snow was oddly comforting. Her phone buzzed on the table, a text from her best friend Erica. "Hope you're having fun, party pooper. Happy almost New Year." Maria laughed to herself and typed back, "Happy New Year to you too. Stay safe." Just as she hit send, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was from an unknown number. The message read, "Look outside." Maria froze. Her heart skipped a beat as she reread the message. Surely it was a mistake, a wrong number, or someone trying to prank her. She glanced at the window but saw nothing unusual. The street was empty except for the occasional car and the soft snow. She decided to ignore it, setting her phone face down on the table. But then, another message came through. "You're not alone." Her stomach dropped. Maria stood up, her eyes darting around the room. The apartment was silent, save for the faint hum of the radiator. She locked her door just to be safe and grabbed her phone, typing a response. "Who is this?" A few moments later, another reply. "Your window. Look closer." Every hair on Maria's body stood on end. Slowly, she turned toward the window. The street looked as empty as before, but her gut told her something wasn't right. Midnight was only 15 minutes away, and suddenly, the once cozy quiet felt suffocating. Maria stared at the window, her breath fogging up the glass as she leaned closer. The street was just as empty as before, silent, snow-covered, with no sign of anyone watching. But the feeling of being observed was impossible to shake. She checked her phone again, hoping for a follow-up message that might clarify things. Nothing. The silence in her apartment felt heavier now, as though the walls themselves were closing in. She turned away from the window, trying to brush off the unease. "Just a prank," she muttered to herself. "Nothing to worry about." As she walked back to the table, her phone buzzed again. Her heart skipped a beat. Another message from the unknown number. "Nice sweater. Red is your color." Maria froze, instinctively glancing down. She was wearing a cozy red sweater, a detail no one could have known unless they were watching her right now. Her blood ran cold. She bolted to the window, pulling the curtain tightly shut and double-checking the lock on her door. Grabbing her phone, she called Erica. "Hey," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Are you sure you're still at that party? You didn't send me those texts as a joke, right?" "What texts?" Erica's voice was faint against the music in the background. "I've been on the dance floor all night. What's going on?" Maria hesitated, not wanting to sound paranoid. "It's nothing, just a weird prank. Happy New Year." She hung up before Erica could ask more questions. As she set her phone down, the screen lit up with another text. "Why did you close the curtain?" "I liked the view." Maria's breath hitched. She stood frozen, her eyes darting to the windows and the locked door. Then faintly she heard it, the sound of footsteps crunching on the snow outside. Whoever it was wasn't hiding anymore. Midnight was only 10 minutes away, and Maria realized she might not be alone for long. Maria's heart pounded as the sound of footsteps grew louder, crunching rhythmically through the snow. She pressed her ear to the door, straining to hear. The steps stopped directly outside her apartment. A long pause followed, broken only by the faint hum of the radiator. Her phone buzzed again, another text from the unknown number. "You're a terrible host. Aren't you going to invite me in?" She backed away from the door, her hands trembling. The message confirmed what she feared. Whoever this was, they weren't just outside her building. They were standing right there, at her door. Maria's thoughts raced. She considered calling the police, but hesitated. Would they even take her seriously? And what if this was just an elaborate prank by someone who knew her? The doubt gnawed at her, but the growing unease told her she couldn't take chances. Grabbing her phone, she typed out a quick reply. "Who are you? What do you want?" The response came almost instantly. "Midnight is for new beginnings. Let's make one together." The clock on her phone read 11:54, 6 minutes until midnight. Maria's breathing quickened as she stared at the door, her mind filling with images of what might be on the other side. A sudden, deliberate knock broke the silence. 3 sharp raps, followed by a long pause. Maria froze. The knock came again, slower this time. She didn't move, didn't breathe, hoping whoever it was would leave if she stayed quiet. Then she heard it, the faint sound of the doorknob twisting. She'd locked it, she was sure of that, but the sound sent a wave of panic crashing over her. Backing into the living room, Maria grabbed a heavy candlestick from the table, gripping it tightly. The doorknob stopped turning. Silence again. But when Maria glanced down at her phone, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The shadow of a figure was visible under the crack of the door, motionless, as if waiting for her next move. Maria's chest tightened as she stared at the shadow beneath the door. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. Whoever was out there wasn't going away. Her phone buzzed again, and she flinched, almost dropping it. Another text. "You don't need to be afraid. I just want to come in." Her grip tightened on the candlestick as she backed farther into the room. Every creak of the floorboards felt deafening. She considered yelling for help, but her neighbors were likely out celebrating, and the snow outside would muffle her cries. Suddenly, the shadow shifted. Slowly, it moved away from the door, leaving her in an eerie silence. Maria exhaled shakily, hoping they'd finally left. But her relief was short-lived. The sound of footsteps started again, this time moving toward the window. She spun around, staring at the tightly drawn curtains. The faintest crunch of snow outside sent her heart racing. Maria clutched the candlestick as she approached the window, every nerve in her body on edge. For a moment, she considered peeking out, just to confirm what she feared. Her phone buzzed again. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. I just want to see you." A sharp knock at the window made her jump, dropping the candlestick with a loud clang. Maria froze, her eyes locked on the curtains. Whoever was out there was trying to rattle her, and it was working. "Leave me alone," she shouted, her voice cracking. The knocking stopped. Silence filled the room once more, broken only by her shallow breaths. She grabbed her phone and texted Erica, "Call me now. Please, it's urgent." As she waited, she glanced toward the window again. The snow-covered glass revealed a faint handprint smeared across it, as though someone had been pressing against the outside pane. Her stomach churned, and she stumbled back toward the center of the room, frantically dialing 911. The operator answered, calm and professional, but before Maria could explain, her phone buzzed with another message. She glanced at the screen. "They won't reach you in time." The call dropped, and Maria's phone went dead. Midnight was 5 minutes away. Maria's fingers trembled as she stared at her phone's blank screen. The battery was fine. She had charged it earlier, but now it was completely dead. She felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. The knocking resumed, this time softer and slower. It wasn't coming from the window anymore. Her eyes darted toward the kitchen. The back door, which led to the shared fire escape, was now the source of the sound. Maria's blood turned cold. Her apartment wasn't big, and the thought of someone circling it made her stomach churn. She moved as quietly as she could to the kitchen, stepping over creaky floorboards. Gripping the candlestick again, she peeked around the corner. The back door was locked, the chain still secured, but the knocking persisted, gentle, almost rhythmic. She took a shaky step closer, her mind racing. Should she confront whoever was out there or stay hidden? Before she could decide, her phone buzzed faintly on the counter. It had somehow turned back on, the screen lighting up with a single message. Closer now. Maria's breath hitched as the knocking stopped abruptly. Her eyes darted to the floor, where a faint shadow now pooled under the door. The figure was back, standing silently. She could almost feel them listening, waiting. Her phone buzzed again. "Midnight is ours. Let me in." The clock on the wall ticked loudly, counting down the seconds. 11:58, 2 minutes until the new year. Maria's thoughts spiraled. If this was a prank, it had gone far beyond a joke. If it wasn't... Suddenly, the door handle rattled violently, breaking her train of thought. The chain held firm, but the sound was enough to send her stumbling back. She grabbed a chair and wedged it under the doorknob, her breathing uneven. "I'm calling the police!" she screamed, hoping her voice would scare them off. The rattling stopped, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, faintly from the other side of the door, came a low laugh, a sound that sent chills down her spine. It wasn't loud, but it carried a sinister weight that made her knees weak. The laugh faded, and so did the shadow. Maria hesitated, straining her ears. Nothing. She glanced at the clock. 11:59. 1 minute to midnight. Then came the realization that turned her blood cold. The front door was still unlocked. Before she could move, she heard it creak open. Maria's heart stopped as the front door creaked open, the sound reverberating through the apartment. She froze, torn between the safety of staying hidden in the kitchen and the need to confront whatever had just stepped inside. Her grip on the candlestick tightened as she crept toward the living room, every step deliberate and silent. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of her candles and the faint streetlight filtering through the curtains. The front door hung slightly ajar, letting in a sharp gust of icy air that made the flames flicker. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. It was a mistake. She regretted it instantly. The silence that followed was too loud, too deliberate. She took another step forward, and that's when she saw it. A pair of wet footprints on the hardwood floor, leading from the open door into the shadows of the living room. Her stomach churned. The prints were too large to be her own, and they hadn't been there earlier. Maria backed away, her pulse hammering in her ears. "Whoever you are, get out!" she shouted, her voice cracking. The shadows in the corner seemed to shift, as though something, or someone, was moving just out of sight. Her phone buzzed again, and she fumbled to check it. The same number, the same haunting tone. "It's almost time. Don't you want to meet me?" The clock on the wall ticked loudly. 11:59:40. 20 seconds to midnight. Maria's chest tightened as she turned toward the shadows, her eyes straining to see what was there. "Show yourself!" she demanded, though her voice betrayed her fear. And then, it did. A figure emerged from the darkness, tall and unnervingly still. Its face was obscured by the flickering candlelight, but Maria could see its eyes, piercing, unblinking, and filled with something inhuman. It took a slow step forward, then another, its movements deliberate, as if savoring her terror. Maria stumbled back, her phone slipping from her hand and clattering to the floor. The figure tilted its head, almost curiously, before speaking in a voice that chilled her to the core. "You should have kept the curtains open." The clock struck midnight. Chime after chime echoed through the room, drowning out Maria's frantic breaths. On the 12th chime, the candles extinguished, plunging the apartment into darkness. Maria felt the air grow colder, heavier, as the presence closed in around her. The last thing she heard was the sound of her front door slamming shut, sealing her inside. The darkness enveloped Maria completely, a suffocating void that seemed to press in from all sides. She gripped the candlestick tightly, her knuckles white, her breath shallow and uneven. Her phone lay somewhere on the floor, useless and silent. The only sound now was the faint creak of footsteps circling her. "Who are you?" Maria demanded, though her voice was barely more than a whisper. "What do you want?" A chilling laugh echoed in the room, low and drawn out, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. "It's not about what I want," the voice replied, smooth and cold. "It's about what you invited." Maria's mind raced, trying to piece together the events of the night. Invited? She hadn't invited anyone. Her thoughts snapped back to the messages, the warnings, the moment she ignored the first text telling her to look outside. The footsteps stopped abruptly, the silence as heavy as lead. Then came a whisper, so close it felt like it was right next to her ear. Midnight marks a new beginning. You're mine now. Maria spun around, swinging the candlestick wildly, but it connected with nothing but air. She stumbled, her panic mounting. The temperature dropped further, her breath visible in the faint, icy glow from the window. Finally, she found her phone and grabbed it, the screen lighting up her trembling hands. The message inbox was empty. No texts, no missed calls, nothing to suggest anyone had been contacting her all night. But at the top of the screen, the time read 12:01. Midnight had passed. The front door suddenly burst open, flooding the apartment with light and icy wind. Maria blinked, her eyes adjusting as she stumbled toward it, desperate to escape. She looked back once before stepping outside, but the apartment was empty. The candles had reignited, casting a warm glow over the room. Everything was still, as though the night's events had never happened. The street was quiet, the snow untouched except for her own footprints leading away. Shaking, Maria walked to a nearby cafe, where she found safety in the company of strangers. She told herself it was over, but deep down, she knew the truth. When she returned home the next day, she found a single message on her phone. "See you next New Year's." Jason was finishing his shift at the 24-hour convenience store on New Year's Eve, eager to get home before midnight. It wasn't the ideal way to spend the holiday, but the extra cash was worth it. The store, small and nestled at the edge of town, was eerily quiet as the clock approached 10 p.m. He looked out through the large glass windows, watching as the streetlights flickered faintly in the heavy snow. Not a single car had passed in the last hour, and his only customers were a few last-minute shoppers grabbing cheap champagne and snacks. Jason leaned on the counter, scrolling through his phone to pass the time. Then, the door chime rang. A man in a dark coat stepped inside, shaking snow off his shoulders. Jason looked up, offering a polite nod. "Evening. Happy New Year." The man didn't respond. He walked slowly through the aisles, his movements deliberate, as though he were searching for something specific. Jason watched him out of the corner of his eye. Something about the man felt off. His coat was heavy and outdated, the kind you'd see in old photographs. His boots left no trace of snow or water on the floor, which Jason only noticed because he'd just mopped. When the man reached the back of the store, he stopped and stood still, his back to Jason. He didn't pick anything up, didn't move, just stood there, staring at the shelves. Jason cleared his throat. "Need help finding something?" he called out. No answer. The silence stretched on, making Jason's skin crawl. He stepped out from behind the counter, hesitant. "Sir, you all right?" Before Jason could get closer, the man turned around suddenly, his face partially obscured by the shadows of the dim aisle lights. His eyes, sharp and intense, locked onto Jason's. He spoke, his voice calm but unsettling. "Almost time?" Jason blinked, confused. "Time for what?" The man smiled faintly, a chilling expression that sent a shiver down Jason's spine. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the store, the door chime echoing behind him. Jason rushed to the window, but when he looked outside, the man had vanished into the snowy night. Jason stood by the window, staring out into the snow-covered parking lot. The man had vanished without a trace, leaving no footprints behind. The icy air from the briefly opened door still lingered in the store, sending chills down his spine. He shook his head, trying to brush it off. "Probably just some weirdo," he muttered to himself, heading back to the counter. But the unease didn't leave him. Something about the man's words, "almost time," nagged at the back of his mind. As he sat back down, the door chime rang again. Jason's heart skipped a beat, but when he looked up, it was just a young woman bundled in a thick scarf and coat. She smiled politely, her arms full of snacks and a bottle of soda. "Sorry, cutting it close for New Year's, huh?" she said, placing her items on the counter. Jason forced a smile. "No problem, quiet night anyway." As he scanned her items, he couldn't help glancing out the window again. The snow was falling heavier now, blanketing the empty lot. The streetlights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. The woman handed him cash, and as he made change, she tilted her head, frowning. "Did something happen here?" she asked. Jason blinked. What do you mean? She pointed toward the back aisle. There's someone back there, isn't there? His stomach dropped. He turned toward the aisles but saw nothing. No, he said, his voice unsteady. There's no one else here. The woman gave a nervous laugh. I must be seeing things. Guess it's the snowstorm messing with my head. She grabbed her bag and hurried out the door, the chime ringing once again. Jason followed her movement with his eyes until she disappeared into the night. He sighed, turning back toward the aisles. But as he did, his blood ran cold. A shadow flickered at the edge of his vision, near the same spot where the man in the coat had stood earlier. Hello? Jason called out, his voice breaking slightly. No answer. He grabbed his phone, switching on the flashlight, and moved cautiously toward the back of the store. When he reached the aisle, it was empty. But the air was colder here, biting against his skin. Then he noticed something. A single footprint, wet and impossibly large, pressed into the clean tile. Jason's phone buzzed in his hand, making him jump. It was a text from an unknown number. He's coming back. Jason stared at the text, his hands trembling. He's coming back. The words burned into his mind. How did someone know what had just happened? His stomach churned as he glanced around the empty store, the silence growing heavier with each passing second. Trying to steady himself, he typed back, "Who is this? What do you want?" He hit send and waited. Nothing. Suddenly, the store lights flickered. Jason froze, his pulse racing. The hum of the overhead fluorescence seemed louder now, almost oppressive. Then the lights steadied again, leaving the store as dim and unnervingly quiet as before. He moved back to the counter, his eyes darting toward the front door. Outside, the snowstorm had intensified, the wind howling against the glass. The parking lot was still empty. No cars, no sign of life, just the swirling snow. His phone buzzed again. Another text from the unknown number. He never left. Jason's heart sank. He turned, scanning the aisles once more. All right, whoever's messing with me, it's not funny, he shouted, his voice echoing through the small store. If this is some kind of joke, cut it out! No response. He grabbed the store's landline phone and quickly dialed his manager's number. As the line rang, he kept his eyes locked on the aisles. Come on, pick up, he muttered under his breath. But the call went to voicemail. Jason cursed and hung up. The door chime rang again. Jason whipped around, gripping the edge of the counter. The door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the wind. But no one had entered or exited. Jason rushed to the door, slamming it shut and locking it. The storm outside howled louder, as though mocking his attempt at safety. He turned back toward the store, his nerves frayed, and noticed something new. The wet footprint he'd seen earlier now had a matching pair, and they were leading toward the storage room. Jason's throat tightened as he stared at the second footprint. It was unmistakable, wet and larger than any shoe he'd ever seen. His mind raced, trying to come up with a rational explanation, but nothing about this night felt rational anymore. The footprints led straight to the storage room at the back of the store, the heavy metal door slightly ajar. He hadn't been back there all shift, and he was sure no one else had gone inside. Grabbing the flashlight app on his phone, Jason stepped cautiously toward the door, every nerve in his body screaming for him to turn back. "Hello?" he called out, his voice wavering. The only response was the faint hum of the cooler from inside the storage room. He reached the door and nudged it open with his foot, the hinges groaning loudly in the silence. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing rows of shelves stocked with drinks and snacks. Everything appeared untouched, except for one detail, a dark, wet patch on the floor near the back wall. It was faint, as though someone had been standing there moments ago. Jason swallowed hard and stepped inside, the door creaking as it swung slightly behind him. His breath fogged in the air. How was it so cold back here? He inched closer to the dark spot, the floor beneath his boots feeling damp. The cold grew sharper, biting at his skin. Then he noticed something else, scratches on the wall near the wet patch. Long, jagged marks, as though something sharp had clawed at the surface. Jason's flashlight trembled as he traced the scratches with his eyes. They were too deep, too deliberate to be from an accident. A faint noise broke the silence, sending a jolt through him. It was coming from behind the shelves, soft, rhythmic, like someone breathing. Jason froze, every instinct screaming at him to leave. But his curiosity won out. He stepped closer, gripping his phone tightly. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice barely above a whisper. The breathing stopped. Jason held his breath, the silence pressing down on him like a weight. Then, with sudden force, the storage room door slammed shut, plunging him into total darkness. His flashlight flickered, and in its brief, dim glow, Jason saw something that made his blood run cold. A shadow, impossibly large, moving toward him from the back of the room. Jason stumbled backward, his flashlight flickering erratically as the shadow moved closer. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat deafening in the pitch-black room. He fumbled for the door handle behind him, but it wouldn't budge. The air around him felt heavy, freezing, as though all the warmth had been sucked from the space. "Who are you?" Jason shouted, his voice cracking. The shadow stopped, just beyond the reach of his dimming light. He could barely make out its shape, tall, unnaturally still, its edges shifting like smoke. Then it spoke, its voice low and rasping, as if coming from somewhere far away. "You don't belong here." Jason's stomach lurched. "I work here. What do you want from me?" he stammered, his voice trembling. The shadow didn't respond. Instead, it tilted its head, an almost human gesture that only made it more terrifying. The light on Jason's phone dimmed further, the battery inexplicably draining, and he was left in near total darkness. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed in the room, slow, deliberate, and heavy. Jason gripped his phone tightly, forcing himself to point the flickering beam toward the sound. The shadow moved closer, and with each step, the temperature seemed to plummet further. Jason's phone buzzed in his hand, startling him. He glanced at the screen, his breath catching in his throat. Another text from the unknown number? "Run." He didn't need to be told twice. Jason darted past the shadow, his shoulder grazing something ice-cold and solid. He reached the door and slammed his weight against it, his hands fumbling for the lock. The door finally gave way, and he burst out into the store, gasping for air. The warm lights of the store felt like a lifeline, but the sense of safety was short-lived. As Jason locked the storage room door behind him, he noticed something chilling. Wet footprints, the same oversized ones, were now trailing out into the main store. Jason froze, his eyes following the path. The prints led toward the front counter, then stopped abruptly. He held his breath, scanning the aisles for any sign of movement. The store was still, eerily so. Then the door chime rang. Jason turned toward the sound, his heart racing. The front door was wide open, snow blowing in from the storm outside. But no one was there. The clock on the wall struck 11:58. 2 minutes to midnight. Jason grabbed the landline phone, but the line was dead. The only sound now was the faint echo of the chime, repeating as though something, or someone, was still lingering just out of sight. Jason's breath came in shallow gasps as he stood frozen behind the counter, staring at the open front door. Snow swirled into the store, carried by the relentless storm outside. He fought the urge to run, knowing instinctively that whatever had entered or left wasn't gone. He grabbed the baseball bat kept under the counter, his fingers trembling as he gripped it tightly. The wet footprints on the floor glistened under the flickering store lights, leading from the counter toward the aisles. Jason stepped out cautiously, his boots squeaking on the damp floor. "All right," he called out, his voice shaky but louder than before. "If you're messing with me, it's not funny. Show yourself." The store remained silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerators. Jason scanned the aisles, his flashlight beam cutting through the rows of shelves. Nothing, no movement, no shadow, just an empty store. His phone buzzed again, the sudden vibration almost making him drop it. Another text from the same unknown number. "He's watching." Jason's eyes darted to the windows. The parking lot was still empty, the snow undisturbed. But as he turned back toward the aisles, he saw it. A dark figure at the end of the farthest row. Tall, still, and faintly illuminated by the flickering overhead lights. The figure didn't move, its presence heavy and oppressive. Jason's knuckles whitened around the bat. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the store. The figure tilted its head, that same unnatural gesture he'd seen in the storage room. Jason took a step forward, gripping the bat tighter, but as he blinked, the figure disappeared. He whipped his head around, scanning the aisles frantically. The store was empty again. Or so he thought. A low, raspy whisper filled the air, sending chills down his spine. "You can't leave!" Jason spun around, his flashlight beam catching the figure again, this time closer, standing just outside the light's edge. He swung the bat, but it connected with nothing, the momentum nearly knocking him off balance. The lights flickered violently, plunging the store into brief darkness. When they steadied again, the figure was gone. But Jason wasn't alone. He heard heavy, deliberate footsteps behind him, moving slowly, purposefully. He turned just in time to see the storage room door creak open. Midnight was less than a minute away, and Jason knew that whatever was coming, it wouldn't stop until it had him. Jason's heartbeat thundered in his chest as he stared at the storage room door, now wide open. The heavy darkness beyond its threshold seemed alive, almost pulsating with a cold, malevolent energy. He tightened his grip on the bat, every instinct screaming for him to run, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. The clock on the wall struck midnight, its chime echoing unnaturally loud in the empty store. The fluorescent lights flickered and went out completely, plunging Jason into total darkness. His phone, clutched tightly in his other hand, buzzed one final time. With trembling fingers, he raised it to his face and read the message. Midnight. It's time. The hum of the refrigerator stopped, leaving an eerie silence. Jason's flashlight flickered back to life, the weak beam barely illuminating the space in front of him. Slowly, he stepped toward the storage room, his breath visible in the freezing air. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking. It wasn't bravery, it was desperation. From the darkness of the storage room came a sound that froze him in place, a low, guttural laugh, deep and inhuman. It reverberated through the room, growing louder and more distorted, as if it were echoing through an endless void. Jason turned to run, but the aisles seemed longer now, stretching infinitely in both directions. The bat slipped from his fingers, clattering uselessly to the floor. The laugh grew closer, followed by footsteps that seemed to come from all around him. He stumbled toward the front door, his phone shaking in his hand. But when he reached the exit, it was gone. The glass doors had vanished, replaced by a solid wall. Jason spun around, his breathing erratic. The aisles were gone too. The store had transformed into a featureless black void, with only the faint glow of his phone lighting his face. The laugh stopped. Silence pressed down on him, thick and suffocating. Then, from the darkness, the figure emerged again. It was clearer now, tall and impossibly thin, its features obscured, but its glowing eyes piercing through the void. Jason tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure raised a hand, its fingers unnaturally long and claw-like. "You shouldn't have stayed," it said in a voice that sounded like the groan of ancient wood. The phone screen in Jason's hand went dark. The last thing he saw was the figure's outstretched hand reaching for him before everything faded to black. The next morning, the store manager found the place untouched, the aisles neat and the lights working perfectly. But Jason was gone. His car was still in the lot, his belongings untouched. The only sign of him was a single wet footprint near the counter, one far too large to have been his.